So welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our latest CAARI online lecture. I'm Lindy Crew, and I'm CAARI's director, and I'll shortly be introducing our speaker, Dr. Robert Merrillees. Before I do so, we're joined today by a special guest, the Deputy Head of Mission at the Australian High Commission Cyprus, Michelle Anderson. And I'd now like to invite Michelle to say a few words of welcome. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you to CAARI and to Dr. Lindy Crew for inviting me today to join you online for Dr. Robert Merrillees' lecture on Leonardo da Vinci and his visits to Cyprus. I haven't been on Aphrodite's island for very long, having arrived in Cyprus in December, but despite the lockdown number 2 being imposed just as I arrived, I've still managed to get out and visit a few open-air archaeological sites, and I've found them to be absolutely fascinating. It is with excitement that I look forward to the 3 years that I'll be here in Cyprus, and with it the opportunity to explore as much of this incredible island and its historic sites as I can. In visiting these sites, I've had a taste of what Dr. Merrillees must have felt when he first stepped on the island more than 60 years ago. The breadth and accessibility of history contained on one little island is mind-blowing for this little Australian. I particularly like how the ancient world is intricately linked to today's modern Cyprus, via, of course, the very crucial period of the island's history, which is the Middle Ages. It was during a visit to Lefkara with a colleague where my attention was drawn to Leonardo da Vinci's link to Cyprus, and we pondered the truth behind the mystery or behind the myth or the moment in history. I'm particularly looking forward to what Dr. Merrillees has to say about this tonight. As you're no doubt aware, Dr. Merrillees is no stranger to Cyprus. He first came to Cyprus in his youth as a student of archaeology, and since that time has become well acquainted with the island. His digs have taken him, his wife and daughters across the entire island, no doubt embedding in them the same love for Cyprus. Dr. Merrillees describes his time in Cyprus as unforgettable, and that it left him with a sense of achievement, lasting friendships, and a nostalgia for times past. Dr. Merrillees, not being satisfied with one career as an archaeologist, also led a double life, that of an Australian diplomat, where he served Australia across the globe, most notably as ambassador to Sweden, Finland and Estonia, Israel, and later Greece and Bulgaria. And for the linguist nerds amongst us, this is doubly impressive, as the root of the Greek word for diplomat means a doubling, twofold, exactly enunciating what Dr. Merrillees achieved, having 2 parallel careers. Though never posted to Cyprus in a diplomatic role, Dr. Merrillees visited the island as rapporteur of the Commonwealth Committee on Cyprus in 1977. In a coincidental twist of fact, 40 years later, in 2017, his daughter Antoinette was in Nicosia acting as the temporary head of the Australian High Commission. I'm told that during his daughter's short-term mission, it was there he endeared himself to the team at the High Commission through sharing with them his passion for the island and its deep history. Dr. Merrillees has written extensively on both archaeological topics as well as a book which combines diplomacy with archaeology. And there really is no better place in the world to combine the two, but here in Cyprus and the wider Eastern Mediterranean, where archaeology and diplomacy have gone hand in hand for centuries. In his book, Diplomatic Digs, Dr. Merrillees declared himself a Cyprus addict. Addicted to the people, scenery and the brandy. I'm yet to try the local brandy, but I do concur with him on the people in the countryside. So Dr. Merrillees, I look forward to trying a brandy with you in person when next you visit. For a broader context, you might be interested to know that Australia's history with Cypriot archaeology dates back to 1937, when Dr. James Stewart led the first Australian digs on the island of Venus on the north coast. I apologise if I'm bastardising these words. His work was the foundation that Dr. Merrillees used to build the structure for Australian archaeologists to work in Cyprus today. Dr. Merrillees in fact trained under Dr. Stewart before leading digs in Flamudi and CAARI. Australians who include CAARI Director Dr. Lindy Crew, Dr. Craig Barker, Dr. Andrew Snedden, Dr. David Frankel, along with Dr. Jenny Webb, have worked extensively on Cyprus archaeology sites and finds for decades. Sadly, due to the pandemic, Australian archaeologists, including Dr. Merrillees, have not been able to visit Cyprus for over 14 months now. This was especially disappointing considering 2020 was the 25th year in which the Australian archaeological students and volunteers have worked on the Paphos Theatre project led by Dr. Barker. Cyprus is indebted to these Australians who have fallen in love with its history, archaeology and distant past. They've contributed invaluably to Cyprus's knowledge of its ancient past, its history and its immensely rich cultural heritage, all the while engaging Cypriotes and narrowing the divide between our two island states. Dr. Merrillees, on behalf of the Australian High Commissioner and the team at the High Commission, I'd like to thank you for your incredible life's work and your ever-growing contributions to the Australian-Cyprus bilateral relationship. And just before I hand you back to Dr. Crew, I'd like to leave you with a quote from Dr. Merrillees' book, Diplomatic Digs, in which he reminds us that current events are nothing more than the ancient history of the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for those very kind words, and we look forward to further collaborations with the Australian High Commission around archaeological research on Cyprus. It is now my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Dr. Robert Merrillees. In addition to the diplomatic career that we've just heard a little about, Robert has had a long and fruitful archaeological career. He graduated from the University of Sydney in 1959 and went on to University College London, where he was awarded his PhD in 1965. Robert first excavated, and I hope I got this right, in 1961 at CAARI with James Stewart, working on the Bronze Age cemeteries on the North Coast. And he's continued to pursue his research interests in Cypriot and wider Mediterranean archaeology for over 60 years. Robert's bibliography encompasses over 200 items, including monographs and numerous articles on subjects ranging from Bronze Age pottery around the Mediterranean, trade and textual identifications, through to museum collections and historiography. Robert was the director of CAARI when I was here undertaking research for my PhD, and I was thrilled to have such an eminent Bronze Age specialist at hand and eagerly sought his advice. During this time, I remember I was devastated that my book on spindle whorls had received a mixed review. I was accused of failing to address the question of the woolliness of sheep. I went to Robert in his office quite upset and complained of this injustice. He pragmatically told me, "There's nothing you can do about it. Get used to it." Robert has certainly never shied away from archaeological controversies, fearlessly arguing his case, whether it be on the question of the identification of al-Ashir of textual sources with Cyprus, the uses of opium during the Bronze Age, or the topic we will hear of tonight. Robert was to have delivered this lecture live at CAARI last October, but the pandemic intruded. We are hopeful that he may be able to reschedule for late this year and give a live lecture on a different topic. Should this be possible, we will be awaiting you with brandy sours at the ready. I would now like to invite Dr. Merrillees to present his lecture entitled Leonardo da Vinci's Legendary Visit to Cyprus in 1481 AD and its link to Lefkara. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for your kind words. They're very much appreciated. It's not often that anyone in Australia's diplomatic service has had anything complimentary to say about me. And before beginning this lecture, I should also explain, just as Lindy has mentioned, that this lecture was supposed to have been given not only in 2019, but also in 2020, but for a variety of reasons, including the pandemic, it was not possible to be delivered. And so I'm very grateful to Lindy for giving me this opportunity to give it today. In the meantime, the study on which it's based has already been published in full in the Cahiers du Centre d'études Cypriotes in France, and a much abridged version appeared in the bulletin of the Association for the Study of Travel in the Near East and Egypt. So if for some of you this is a case of stale as well as fake news, I apologize. But there are riddles still to be solved, which I'll be explaining to you, and you may at least be able to enjoy my PowerPoint presentation, which has not been shown before. I greatly enjoyed putting the PowerPoint together, and I would have been sorry not to have shared it with others. Need to. Leonardo da Vinci needs no introduction to you. His reputation extends in all ways far beyond anything that he or his contemporaries could ever have imagined in the 15th and 16th centuries. In fact, his fame only became universal last century. In 1952, on the 500th anniversary of his birth, the Royal Academy of Arts in London held an exhibition of his works. In the accompanying booklet, he was described as perhaps the most prodigally gifted human being produced by any age. The year 2019 marked the 500th anniversary of his death in Amboise, France, and the Louvre held a major exhibition devoted to his illustrious memory and produced a sumptuous catalogue, which you see on the right. The occasion was also notable for the unseemly row that broke out between France and Italy over the loan of works from Italy. In neither of these catalogues is there any mention of Leonardo's alleged visit to Cyprus. To mark the occasion in Cyprus, 2 lectures were given in Nicosia in 2019 under the auspices of the embassy, and the ambassador picked up the story of Leonardo's legendary visit to Cyprus and his donation of an altar cloth to the Milan Cathedral. This is taken from the internet, which shows both his statement and also the advertisement for the second of the lectures that was given in Nicosia. The Chateau du Clos-Lucé in Amboise, where Leonardo spent the last 3 years of his life, is one of the major tourist attractions of France. It alone attests to his undiminished international appeal, even if there is little authentic left to show of his passage, apart, of course, from the building. It was a visit there that sparked my interest in this subject, a far cry from what our younger daughter calls my little brown pots. This slide shows an imaginary reproduction of his studio in the Chateau du Clos-Lucé. Almost everything in it is modern, made to look old, but is still very evocative, like the rest of the setup. Even faraway Australia, which was not yet known to the Europeans of the Renaissance, hosted a touring exhibition of models of his mechanical inventions lent by the Museum of Leonardo da Vinci in Florence. Leonardo has been the subject of innumerable studies, so it might have been thought that there was nothing very much more to say about any aspect of his life or his achievements. But if there is one footnote that has been academically overlooked and under-researched, it's his alleged involvement with the island of Cyprus. The Republic of Cyprus has had no hesitations on this score. On the 15th of June 1981, to mark the 500th anniversary of Leonardo's legendary visit to Cyprus, its Department of Postal Services issued a set of 3 postage stamps showing the Last Supper. Sorry. Back. The Last Supper, a self-portrait of Leonardo, and the Cathedral of Milan with a piece of Lefkara lace below. Those are the 3 stamps that you see on the top right corner. In the accompanying statement, the Post Office set out its reasons for this commemoration in the following terms. Although there does not exist any historical evidence for the visit of Leonardo to Cyprus, the description given in his notebooks about the beauties of the island allows us to presume that Leonardo has indeed visited Cyprus. This presumption is reinforced by sources according to which the visit took place in 1481, 500 years ago, during the reign of Catherine Cornaro, Queen of Cyprus, who entertained the famous painter. It is said that Leonardo was so impressed by the Lefkara laces that he took with him one which he offered to be used on the altar of the Cathedral of Milan. And not one to lose an opportunity of capitalizing on some historical attraction in and to the island, the official portal of Cyprus tourism, which I consulted again on the 25th of April, has taken advantage of the story to declare, legend has it that the famous painter Leonardo da Vinci himself visited the village of Lefkara in 1481 and bought a lace altar cloth which he donated to Milan Cathedral. Now that Leonardo was aware of the existence of Cyprus is not in doubt. Explicit reference to the island is contained in his notebooks. They're under a heading Sito de Venere, which is usually translated as a shrine of Venus. He outlined the plan for some kind of water garden feature, ending with this passage. And I quote, "From the southern seaboard of Cilicia may be seen to the south the beautiful island of Cyprus, which was the realm of the goddess Venus. And many there have been who, impelled by her loveliness, have had their ships and rigging broken upon the rocks which lie amidst the seething waves. Here the beauty of some pleasant hill invites the wandering mariners to take their ease amongst the flowery verdure, where the zephyrs continually come and go, filling with sweet odors the island and the encompassing sea. Alas, how many ships have foundered there? How many vessels have been broken upon these rocks? Here might be seen an innumerable host of ships, some broken in pieces and half buried in sand. Here is visible the poop of one, and there the prow. Here a keel, and there a rib. And it seems like the day of judgment, when there shall be a resurrection of dead ships, so great is the mass that covers the whole northern shore. There the northern winds resounding make strange and fearful noises." That's the end of the quotation. Now, these annotations, which were written about 1508 and 1510, were accompanied on the same sketch, on the same sheet, by the sketch of a square fortress-like palazzo, together with the ground plan of the building. You'll see it on the right of this particular slide. There is the palazzo building, and there's the ground plan of the same structure. It also has a drawing, as you see, of a naked male flanked by some scarcely visible horses. Despite the claim that the structure belonged to a temple of Venus, as some of the commentators have written, neither the topographical details nor the drawings of the notebook have anything obvious to do with Venus or Aphrodite, or for that matter, Cyprus. The only truly factual reference in this extract from Leonardo's writings were instructions for the layout of a garden and the geographical position of Cyprus south of Cilicia. It seems that his references were inspired by the mythical gardens of Cyprus, of Venus on Cyprus. And that figure of the naked male, the figure of Neptune, drawn alongside the building, which you see here, was based upon Michelangelo's sculpture of David and is considered by the authorities possibly to have been the idea of a fountain sculpture. Now, what is clear from all the translations and interpretations of Leonardo's notebooks is that almost every authority was as unfamiliar with Aphrodite's cult places in Cyprus, especially the famous temple at Peloponnesus, as was Leonardo himself. Until the 18th century, European knowledge of Aphrodite's sanctuary at Kuklia was still rudimentary, secondhand and inaccurate, and even then remained largely sketchy and derivative for another 50 years. And so despite the modern appropriation of the names like Aphrodite gardens, Venus gardens, and even Pelepophos gardens for commercial accommodation in the southwestern corner of Cyprus today, no garden is known to have been associated with the worship of Aphrodite and Venus in Greek and Roman times at Old Paphos, though of course medieval chroniclers and Western travelers thought otherwise. In any case, there's no certainty that Leonardo used the name of Venus for anything other than its symbolism for beauty, fertility, and gardens. In addition, the authorities who referred to this passage have allowed themselves to be influenced in their translations and interpretations by the subsequent mention of Cyprus and carried away by its mythological associations. Leonardo's Sito di Venere doesn't mean garden, sanctuary, shrine, or temple of Venus, but simply the site or the place of Venus. The beauty of Cyprus, eye of the beholder, and this slide will give you some idea of the magical quality of the island's landscape when I first saw it 60 years ago. And no doubt this impression was shared and brought back by other travelers more than 500 years ago. Leonardo's description of shipwrecks littering the north coast of the island would appear to be a flight of his creative imagination, inspired perhaps by stories he heard and read of storms and shipwrecks in the Levant. These were commonplace in the Mediterranean during the era of the sailing vessel, especially in winter, and there exist any number of accounts of the violence of nature on maritime traffic in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 15th and the 16th centuries. Shipwrecks there certainly have been since time immemorial around Cyprus, but the primary cause was storms, not underground rocks. A cataclysmic storm was one of Leonardo's favorite subjects during the last decade of his life, in both his drawings and his writings. There exist several long passages in which he describes with relish a huge storm overwhelming a landscape and the futile struggles of man and animal against the forces of nature. Now, I show you this slide simply to reacquaint you with the geographical features around the Eastern Mediterranean. I don't need to point out the names to you, but the importance of just visualizing this image is because of the next one. This is in fact a sketch made by Leonardo of the island and the Eastern Mediterranean, which appears in his Codex Atlanticus, dating to around 1493 to 1494. Now you'll notice that there are no names attached to any of the land masses or seas, and no topographical features or places like settlements are indicated. But you will see here Italy and Sicily, Greece, Crete, Anatolia, and there's Cyprus, this sausage-like sketch that is in its correct place in the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean. And if you compare it with the map that I've just shown you, making allowance for the fact that this is a sketch, this is a tolerably accurate reproduction of the region. Furthermore, he has been credited with the composition of a Mappa Mundi, dated to after 1514, and to two small globes. The first of them was made of ostrich eggshells around 1540 in the top image, and the bottom image in the second was made of copper a little later and is now called the Lenox globe. It's in the New York Public Library. I show you the picture of the Salvator Mundi because in his left hand, Christ has a globe very similar to the ones on which these particular inscriptions were engraved. And you'll notice that both of them are very similar, with again, Italy over on the left, Greece, Anatolia, and Cyprus here, not quite so flattened, but a little bit more accurately portrayed, but nonetheless there's a very close resemblance with these two globes. But you'll notice that in none of them is the island specifically named. So the question now comes is, where did Leonardo get his geographical information from? He doesn't give any of his sources, and there's no independent record that he wrote about Cyprus from first-hand experience. No known surviving account of the time outside Leonardo's own writings contain any hint that he embarked on a trip overseas to the Levant at the end of his residence in Florence and before he settled in Milan in the early 1480s. This factoid appears to have been generated and sustained by the assumption that his references to Cyprus were based on personal observation and not on secondary data. In fact, there can be little doubt that Leonardo owed the essentials of his information about Cyprus to contacts he made and documents he consulted in Italy. The paucity of hard facts about Cyprus in his notes and the lack of references to the quotes for his knowledge make it impossible to specify the most likely sources he drew on, but descriptions of Cyprus were certainly available to him, and leaving aside what he may have picked up in conversations, there are 2 printed works in Italian which he could have had access to, and one he certainly did. The first and the most significant one was the first edition of Santo Brasca's Pilgrimage to the Holy Land, which was published in Milan in 1481 and has been reproduced in the volume on the left. Santo Brasca was the head of the ducal chancellery of Galeazzo Sforza in Milan and made the voyage to the Holy Land and back between April and November 1480. Santo Brasca kept a diary during the trip and promptly on his return to Italy, wrote it up and printed a day-to-day account of his travels. This included 2 visits to Cyprus, a short one to Limassol on the 14th of July going east, and a longer one from the 15th to the 24th of August going back. In the course of these stopovers, he actually visited and recorded the ruins of a palace of Venus near Paphos. There were 3 other reports written on the same pilgrimage, but Santo Brasca's no less interesting observations have never been translated from the original Italian until recently, and for some curious reason, his itinerario has escaped the attention of almost everybody concerned with the history of Cyprus. On the references to Paphos in the text, the Italian archaeologist Gabriele Rossi Osmida has published a very enlightening commentary, and I will simply quote from it because he places the actual visit by Santo Brasca to Paphos in its correct historical context. He said, Santo Brasca went to Paphos to see the ancient ruins of the temple of Papha Aphrodite, which the islanders claimed were the remains of a palace once belonging to the mythical goddess. Here Brasca witnessed some strange antique dealings by then a customary practice amongst gallery captains. On the trip from Venice to the ports of the Middle East, galleys carried fairly heavy cargoes, stowed in the hold to the point of overflowing, and on the arrival in the Middle East, the merchandise was traded, mainly for spices, which were considerably lighter than the previous cargo. And I simply show you this slide to illustrate the island as it was known, the mariners of Venice and indeed of the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean, together with illustrations of the sorts of ships that we're talking about. Rossi Osmida continues, obviously, the fact that the ships were now lighter than they had arrived in was a handicap on the return journey, since the vessel was too light and tended to list and to drift. Initially, the problem was solved by weighing the vessels down with a ballast of sand and stones. But realizing there was a shortage of building stone in Venice, the captains began to load blocks of marble to be sold to the buildings of the city's building sites. In the 15th century, when the patricians vied with each other, showing off their riches, the most sought after stones were columns, capitals, and general architectural elements from ancient Greek and Roman constructions used to embellish the churches and palaces of Venice. Brasco saw one of these cargoes of stone taken directly from the ancient temple of Aphrodite at Paphos. The chronicler from Milan simply recorded this fact without any further comment, which suggests that removing these particular kinds of architectural elements was a common practice at the time. Leonardo's alleged visit to Cyprus in 1481 would have coincided with Queen Caterina Cornaro's reign in the island from 1474 to 1489. During his visit to Cyprus in 1480, Santo Brasca did have an audience in Nicosia with Caterina, who bestowed on him the Order of the Sword. But despite extensive research, no mention has been found of Leonardo's presence in Cyprus in 1481, or indeed at any other time, and there's no indication that Caterina, who returned to Italy at the end of her reign, ever met him anywhere. Another source of Leonardo's knowledge of Cyprus may have been the Isolario, compiled originally on vellum around 1480, again by Bartolommeo dalli Sonetti, a Venetian navigator who claimed he had based his maps on the Greek islands of the Aegean Sea, together with Cyprus, on his own observations. This manuscript in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich consists of 60 maps, painted in colour with Cyprus at the end, and descriptions of the islands written in the form of sonnets, like the one on the right. The volume was subsequently published in Venice around 1485 with woodcut illustrations in black outline of the islands, including Cyprus, and sonnets printed in type. And you'll see the illustration of Cyprus accompanying the published version of this particular sonnet. Just which Bartolomeo this was and whether Leonardo knew him is uncertain, so we cannot necessarily link this particular volume with his knowledge of Cyprus. Santo Brasca's or Bartolomeo's works and the known contents of Leonardo's library, there is in fact one instance where Leonardo is known to have accessed and may even have had in his possession a copy of the book which he evidently drew on for his fictional adventure in the East. This is Sir John Mandeville's Travels, which has been described as a carefully crafted fiction pieced together from a wide range of sources by an erudite and often entertaining author of unknown identity. It first came out in French manuscript form around 1356, and it went on to become one of the most widely read and influential travel books in Europe during the Renaissance. It was subsequently translated into numerous other European languages, and the first Italian edition was published in Milan in 1480. Leonardo evidently borrowed from Mandeville his descriptions of Levantine topography and customs, but not for his description of Cyprus, which Mandeville no more visited than Leonardo did. Leonardo's maps of the Eastern Mediterranean, including Cyprus, in the notebooks and globes could have been based on any number of sources, especially Portolan's, that is, mariners' charts like this one from the 16th century. Nowhere, however, does he specify the originals of the maps he copied, and the purpose of their inclusion in the notebooks is now very difficult to work out, especially as he didn't name any of the places or features represented. By this time, as you can see, the general configuration of the Eastern Mediterranean was already very well established, and for most of the 15th century, Italy was the center of European production or inspiration for the very best European world maps. When Leonardo drew his sketch in the Codex Atlanticus of the Eastern Mediterranean with the outline of Cyprus, he was based in Milan, but far from isolated through his contacts and journeys in Italy. We come now to the claim that Leonardo da Vinci gave some Lefkara lace to the cathedral in Milan, presumably sometime during or after 1481. Available data don't allow us to establish with confidence the genesis of this historical myth. Nothing daunted, on the 19th of October, 1986, the mayor of Lefkara presented the Duomo in honor of the 600th anniversary of its foundation, a new altar class on which 3 laymen from his village had worked full-time for 6 months in 1981. As we've seen, the cathedral figures are one of the commemorative stamps issued by the Republic of Cyprus in 1981 with a piece of Lefkara lace underneath. and according to the Cyprus Post website, it still adorns the main altar to date. And I have just learned today, thanks to American friends of our elder daughter, that this cloth, which must be a superb example of the lace maker's craft, is usually used in the Mass on Thursday before Easter. It is said to be a substitute for the one Leonardo acquired in Cyprus and donated in 1481, but the Duomo Museum has not found any record showing that the gift actually occurred. It was embroidered as a variant of what is known in Lefkara as the Leonardo da Vinci pattern, usually associated with the zigzag or potomos motive, but here consisting of contiguous lozenges infilled with smaller geometrical designs symmetrically arranged. It was this pattern, together with the zigzags, which is found on 2 of the 7 parallel bands painted in blue, presumably embroidered, which occur transversely on the right side of the tablecloth in Leonardo's painting of the Last Supper in the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan. There is the painting itself. Here is an enlarged image of the right-hand part of the decoration. There is also one on the left, which is similar but in much less legible state, and it is that on which we will concentrate our attention, because you will see the zigzags together with the lozenges down here, which are the subject of further consideration. The center band and the 2 narrow ones inside the outermost bands are decorated with rows of heraldic devices. Each appears to consist of alternating rosettes and composite groups of birds facing each other with tall, upright, feathered tails either side of a stylized tree. And you can appreciate this particular representation when I turn the slide upside down, or at least on its side, and the birds, as you'll see, with the tail on the right, and there is one here that's been erased on the left, almost certainly represent peacocks. Christianity adopted old Persian and Babylonian symbolism in which the peacock was associated with the tree of life. And here the bird is again associated with immortality. Nothing could be more appropriate for the scene depicted in the mural, and these groups could have had nothing to do with Lefkara lace. And you'll notice here half of the rosette that forms part of this sequence of figures on the band. Now, in addition, there's nothing remotely comparable in the depictions of medieval Cypriot textiles and those embroidered on the altar cloth in Leonardo's painting. Traditional Lefkaretica does not as a rule use naturalistic, only geometrical motives, and certainly not blue stitching. If nothing else, these features illustrate the indigenous character of Leonardo's depiction. The suggestion that this tablecloth originated in Cyprus, or that any part of it was inspired by Cypriot lace designs, therefore has no basis in fact. It was evidently manufactured locally in keeping with contemporary fashion, and sought to have been taken from the convent's laundry for the purposes of Leonardo's painting and unfolded with the creases still visible in his rendition. Now, if there was a link artistically between the designs on the tablecloth in Leonardo's painting and the motif named after him, it's much more likely that the weavers in Lefkara borrowed this pattern from imported Italian fabrics than vice versa. In this respect, it's significant that the official nomination of Lefkara lace for inscription on UNESCO's list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity described it as having been influenced by indigenous craft, the embroidery of Venetian courtiers who ruled the country beginning in 1489, and ancient Greek and Byzantine geometric patterns. As we know, Cyprus was ruled from 1489 to 1570 by Venice, and Lefkara is said to have been frequented by Venetian nobles and their families who treated it as a summer holiday resort. It's even been claimed that the local women in Lefkara copied the fine embroidery on the Venetians' clothes or observed the Venetian ladies during their embroidery and adapted it for their own personal use. But it's not as if Leonardo had nothing to do with Milan and its cathedral, as he became involved with proposals for improvements to the structure, including a competition between 1487 and 1490 for the design of a dome on its roof. And he did, after all, live in Milan from 1482 to 1499 in a house opposite the convent of Santa Maria della Grazia, where he painted the Last Supper. Furthermore, contacts, for better or worse, between the Duchy of Milan and the Kingdom of Cyprus had already existed since the 14th century, and it is certain that cloth and embroidery woven in Cyprus reached Western Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries, but unfortunately, no piece of identifiably Lefkara lace, if manufactured and exported this time, is known to have survived from the Renaissance period in Europe. It's when Leonardo's alleged involvement with Lefkara and its lace first entered the mainstream of modern Cypriot folklore. By 1918, George Jeffrey, who was the curator of ancient monuments, noted that Lefkara was one of the few villages in the island possessing a special industry. What he described as a rough sort of lace is made there by the village women, which not only finds a market in the Levant, but is even exported to Europe. He then continued by saying that the Lefkariti, who are the salespersons of the Cypriot lace, are much addicted to a traffic, more or less legitimate, in antiquities, which they export to Europe on with lace. In 1914, Menelaos Markides, who was the curator of the Cyprus Museum, was much more outspoken when he wrote, and I quote, "In recent years, Lefkara merchants became to some extent the pioneers of this illicit antiquities trade. Side by side with the Lefkaritika, the Cypriot lace so much valued in Europe, the merchants carried with them and offered for sale to the chief European museums Cypriot antiquities. Encouraged by the large profits, they started a systematic trade, visiting all villages and purchasing antiquities at high prices, often encouraging the tomb diggers to work by advancing the money for the preliminary expenses." I'm able to establish Rupert Gunnis is the first person to have written that Leonardo da Vinci was the donor of Lefkara lace to the Duomo in Milan. He was the private secretary to the governor of Cyprus, Sir Ronald Storrs, from 1926 to 1932. And in his Historic Cyprus, which was published in 1936, he boldly stated that Leonardo da Vinci, when he visited the island in 1481, purchased lace at Lefkara for the altar cloth at Milan Cathedral. In the absence of any proof tendered by him for this claim, we may speculate that he picked up the elements of this story in Lefkara itself, which he visited at least on one occasion, when he recorded on the 5th July 1927 in his diary that we received a terrific welcome. We inspected school and church, good iconostasis, and watched the lace makers, tea in the municipality. And it's not difficult to imagine that the local weavers or someone else in the village could have told him about the Leonardo da Vinci pattern or stitch. It's less obvious where the connection with Milan and the date of 1481 came from. In 1937, Sir Ronald Storrs, who was the governor of Cyprus from 1926 to 1932, followed Gunnis's lead in his autobiography, Orientations, which is here listed as Memoirs of Sir Ronald Storrs, where he wrote, "The women of Lefkara are still weaving the lace of which Leonardo da Vinci in 1481 bought panels for the altar of Milan Cathedral." There was, however, no hint of this episode in the Handbook of Cyprus of 1930, which Storrs co-authored with O'Brien. Nor were they unduly complimentary about the quality of the lace made at Lefkara, describing it oddly as one of the minor objects most attractive to collectors. This wording, however, wasn't their own. It was lifted from earlier handbooks. If the postcards of the period are anything to go by, neither Lefkara nor its lace figured much in the public imagination or promotion of Cyprus at this time, and one of the rare, if not the only, postcards recorded showing Lefkara in the 1930s was produced by the Mantovani tourist agency in Larnaca with the caption, "Lefkara, Cyprus, famous for homemade laces." I have not been able to find a copy of it so far, and the only illustration that I have taken from a postcard is the one that you see on the left from 1967. Nothing more that I know of was published on this topic before the Second World War, and it wasn't until after 1945 that the story began to be picked up by the popular guidebooks. In the 1930s, there was a dearth of guidebooks and potted histories for popular consumption about Cyprus. Tourism was scarcely developed, a deficiency which stores recognized and sought to remedy, and in no less than 3 published introductions to the island, his imprint is to be found. The first of them is the extremely rare 12-page booklet you see on the right, Cyprus, the Garden of the Near East, which was published between 1926 and 1928. It contains a short history of Cyprus, but makes no references to Leonardo da Vinci or to Lefkara. It leaves out as much as by what it leaves out as much as it should say, and is a revelation because reading between the lines, you learn a lot about the attitude that he and his administration took towards the island at the time. For example, Storrs studiously ignored the Greek Cypriots' campaign for union with Greece, which led to the destruction of Government House in Nicosia and all of its contents in 1931, including all of Storrs' papers. However, Gunnis, as you'll see, gave free rein to his feelings when he wrote in his diary on the 6th of September 1929 that a Greek Cypriot delegation called on him on the eve of their departure for London to ask for innocence from the new Labour government. And you'll see at the bottom of the extract from his diary, "Damn their impertinence," he commented. "I hope they get their bottoms birched in England." For those of you who are unfamiliar with the practice of birching, or as it was known to me as caning, and have never experienced it, it's a form of punishment that used to be inflicted on schoolboys for bad behavior using a strong stick to hit their buttocks. The 1940s saw the first appearance of 2 more visitor-oriented publications about Cyprus. There was, however, no mention of Leonardo in any popular guidebooks published until Reno Wideson stated in his Cyprus in Picture of 1953 that Leonardo da Vinci bought lace made at Lefkara for the altar cloth at Milan Cathedral when he visited the island in 1481. Nor was the legend taken up in the first edition of Kevorkian Keshishian's historic guide, Romantic Cyprus, which was published in 1946. It wasn't mentioned again in the 3rd edition, but according to the 9th edition, which you see here, it said that when Leonardo da Vinci visited Lefkara in 1481, he bought lace for the altar cloth in Milan Cathedral. There was no mention of Leonardo's purported visit to Cyprus in the celebrated article by Maynard Owen Williams in the National Geographic magazine of July 1928, but Jean and Frank Shaw produced the story in their article in the same magazine in May 1952. Their guide to Cyprus was none other than Reno Wideson, who was also responsible for publicizing the mythological association of Petra to Romeo with the birthplace of Aphrodite. Not all modern guides, however, have taken up the theme, and a noteworthy exception is Ian Robertson's Blue Guide to Cyprus, the first edition of which was published in 1981. It spouted the usual trope without specifying the source, only to recant in the third edition of 1990 with the unexpected remark that there is no evidence that Leonardo da Vinci visited the island in 1481. Gunnes was not, however, the first to have placed Leonardo's alleged visit to Cyprus in 1481, as this was mentioned by Storrs in his work on the chronology of Cyprus, published in Nicosia in 1930, without reference to Lefkara or to Milan. Just where Storrs got his information from is unknown, but one possible source of inspiration could have been Merrillees' The Mind of Leonardo da Vinci, which was first published in London in 1928 and is still being reissued. Merrillees shared the view that Leonardo could have visited the East, including Cyprus, but he also avoided specifying a date, merely noting that Leonardo was present in Florence until 1481 and in Milan from 1483 to 1487. In fact, Leonardo's movements cannot be traced between September 1481 and April 1483, and it's been stated over the years that Leonardo left Florence for Milan in 1481, which may have been the origin of the belief that he went to the Levant in that year with a stopover in Cyprus. It's difficult to avoid the conclusion that Storrs adopted the prevailing academic opinion that Leonardo da Vinci traveled to the Levant, including Cyprus, in the early 1480s, not out of his desire for historical accuracy, but to enhance the attractiveness of Cyprus as a tourist destination. Let's reproduce Storrs' entry on Leonardo's alleged visit almost verbatim in his own chronology of Cyprus, published in 1936 in his volume, Historic Cyprus. This makes one wonder whether he was the instigator, if not the author, of Storrs' version. There are sufficient overlaps in their respective chronologies to indicate a close relationship between them, and Storrs acknowledged Gunnes's help with the chronology of Cyprus in the preface to the booklet. But much more importantly, Storrs and O'Brien were behind a deliberate policy in the 1920s of emphasizing the indigenous character of the island's culture as a counterweight to the Greek Cypriots' attachment to their Hellenic identity and desire for innocence. Lefkara lace was a good way of promoting the concept of a local handicraft tradition, like the other means they took to establish a so-called Cypriot identity, which was neither Greek nor Turkish. In addition, Gunnes was an avid collector of antiquities and ethnography, and was therefore well placed to identify material which might have served the government's purpose. Though Storrs left Cyprus in 1932, they could easily have put two and two together and devised, for economic and political reasons, the story of Leonardo's visit to Cyprus and the acquisition in 1481 of an altar cloth from Lefkara, which he presented to Milan's Cathedral. I can offer no good explanation for the choice of the Duomo in Milan for this purpose, instead, for example, of the convent of Santa Maria della Grazia. It could have had something to do with Leonardo's drawings for the dome, or because the cathedral was the most prominent and public building in the city, but there could be other reasons which you may be able to advance. Finally, it's worth noting that none of the foremost authorities on the history of Cyprus, its myths and ethnography, mentions Leonardo's legendary visit to Cyprus in association with Lefkara and its lace. If you look at the volume devoted to Paphos by Franz Meyer and Vassos Kariois, published in 1984, and still the most expert account available on the history of the region around Peloponnesus and Nea Paphos and its links to the cult of Aphrodite and Venus, Leonardo is conspicuous by his absence. In the end, Cyprus doesn't need its natural attractions enhanced by the visit of a Renaissance Italian artist, however famous, as its appeal is sufficiently great on its own. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure people must have some questions. If anyone would like to type any questions into the chat, feel free. Or if anyone would like to use the raise hand facility, and we can get you to turn on your screen or unmute yourself to ask a question. In the meanwhile, I found it really fascinating. It's a little bit tangential perhaps, but fascinating that all these Venetian shipbuilders were plundering all the stones around about to be able to take them as ballast. And I was wondering, has anyone ever explored the buildings that these have ended up in initially? Has anyone identified any actual Cypriot stonework?
Was the lecture recorded?
Yes, the lecture is being recorded, yes.
When can someone get it?
Well, I am now going to have to extend my technological know-how somewhat to be able to stitch together the two pieces of recording. So you'll have to give me a few days to do that, but I will do it as quickly as I possibly can.
Thank you.
So Robert, there's no evidence about where these stones ended up?
No, and this is the very first reference that I have ever found to the fact that architectural remains, presumably not only from Palepafos, but also from other sites in Cyprus and maybe elsewhere, were removed from their sites and taken to Venice. And this is the very first that I have heard about it, and I know of no particular work that has been done on identifying bits of Cyprus, as it were, in Venetian buildings of this period.
It would require an inscription fragment, perhaps, to get lucky. Sophocles Hadjisavas is saying, "Hi, Robert. Nice to see you at home,
You
even
too,
on my PC
Sophocles.
screen." Nice to see you as well, Sophocles. And does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? Please feel free to raise your hand if you would prefer to do that. Okay. Let's give people a few more minutes. So essentially, Robert, this is a 20th century invention, for sure.
Yes, as far as I can tell, and done essentially for both political and economic reasons by the British administration in the 1930s. It hasn't actually been put together in this way before, because the story has been reproduced endlessly in mostly public documents, and no one has sought to investigate exactly how it came to be adopted the way it has. And of course, it's been so attractive as a legend that nobody has sought actually to try and examine its origins.
Okay, well, I wonder if the next edition of the guidebooks is going to take this on board. Vasiliki Kasyanidou, Lina Kasyanidou has her hand raised. Lina, would you like to turn on your screen and unmute yourself?
Yes. Hi, Robert. Thank you very much.
Lina.
I just wanted to say, I hope no Lefkarites are watching, because this is a story that at least I have heard many times in Lefkara. And I'm glad that you put things to right, because when I went to visit the Last Supper, the first thing that I was looking at was the tablecloth on the wall painting, and like you said, it didn't look anything like a Lefkara lace. So I started thinking, So it was a double history, that it's on the painting of Leonardo and that it is in the Duomo. So I'm sorry, it was a nice story. I'm sorry that it is again a 20th century factoid rather than a true story.
The only other thing that is of interest to me is why the cathedral in Milan was chosen for the donation rather than the convent with the Last Supper. And maybe somebody can advance a few reasons for this, because I can't think of any except the one that I've just given, which is that the cathedral was a far more prominent landmark and more accessible than presumably the convent was.
Despo has her hand up. Despo, would you like to unmute and turn on your video?
Yes. Hello. Yes, thank you, Lindy. And Robert, thank you for this very interesting lecture. Considering what Lindy has said about the stones that were being exported, we all know that stones from the monuments and archaeological sites were exported from Cyprus for centuries, and that it wasn't until 1891 when the Famagusta Stone Law was passed during the first years of the, well, not the first, but the initial stages of the British rule, where they had to stop it. They were actually being shipped everywhere. The stones from Soli, from Famagusta, and this is recorded in all the correspondence. So we do know that this was a practice. I didn't know that it started as early as the 15th century, but it apparently did. So thank you.
Thank you, Despo. We have some questions in the chat. Anne-Marie Noblauch is saying, hi, Robert, nice to see you, and thank you for a wonderful talk. Do you know if there are any other famous sites or places in Italy and the rest of Europe where Lefkara lace of this period has turned up?
I've done a certain amount of research on the garments and cloth that was exported from the Levant to Europe, but so far, at least in the Renaissance period, but so far I have come across no reference to actual Lefkaritica. And it's so distinctive that it's something that would be very clearly identifiable from frescoes, paintings, or other forms of graphic art. And to date, so far, none of the experts have produced a single piece of evidence which shows that it has survived. There are various garments that have survived from this period, but they're certainly not identifiably Lefkaritica.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Marie. Sam Beaver has a question. Robert, thank you for the fascinating lecture. I was sorry to miss the beginning, but was able to listen from the car. I wasn't driving. I will have to listen to the first half of the recording. Look forward to seeing you back on the island at some point. Sam is the High Commissioner, the Australian High Commissioner here, who unfortunately couldn't catch all the lecture.
Thank you, Sam.
Anne-Marie Carr has a question. Thank you, Robert. Are there other stories of Leonardo himself acquiring textiles that might serve as a hub around which the thread of the Lefkara story might have been woven?
Not that I know of. No, I don't think so. I think this is the only one that I've heard of, and it is significant that it was developed around Lefkara rather than any of the other lace forms that are traditional in Cyprus, because Lefkara lace is not the only product of this particular kind that was made in the 19th century, and of course earlier, and right up until the 1930s. So why they chose Lefkara, I suppose because it was a product that was not only well known in Cyprus, but particularly sought after in Europe.
Okay. Titina Lozidou has her hand raised. Titina, would you like to unmute and turn on your screen if you wish?
Thank you very much for this lovely lecture, in-depth research for Leonardo da Vinci's visit to Cyprus, legendary visit to Cyprus. I'm a tourist guide, and it's very difficult to convince the Lefkarides that Leonardo has never been to Cyprus. And in each shop of Lefkara, they have a copy of the edition of the Cyprus Today of, I think, 87, March 87, where they show to each visitor that goes into their shop a picture of the consecration of the tablecloth they offered to the Milan Cathedral. So how can one beat that? Whether Leonardo da Vinci came to Cyprus or not, this is very convincing for the Lefkarides. So it's an enjoyable story for the tourists, just to tell them that We don't think that Leonardo da Vinci ever came to Cyprus, but whether he came or not, here is the consecration of the tablecloth on Milan, on the altar of Milan Cathedral. Thank you very much for this enlightening lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. We have a question in the chat from Elizabeth Hope-Doring. Hi, Robert, great talk. Do you have a sense from the Lefkara archives when the Da Vinci pattern came about? It would be interesting if it were timed with stores and Gunnis.
That I don't know. There is a shortage of what I probably describe as academic works on Lefkara lace. The one that I've used is the one by Angeliki Peridou, whom I knew when she was working in the Cyprus Museum, and she devoted her works to studying these sorts of ethnographic materials. And her book is probably the most authoritative that exists. She doesn't mention Leonardo or the lace, but the actual history of it has never been traced back much beyond the 19th century. And in fact, my search for references to Lefkara lace earlier than, let's say, the middle of the 19th century have been pretty sparse. And the travel guides, the travel books, travel reports of this earlier period don't actually mention Lefkara. Very few visitors seem to have gone there, and almost none of them have referred to the lace. So the actual origins of the designs on the lace are not at all well known, at least to me, except for the fact that it is commonly assumed that they were adopted from Venetian fabrics that were brought to Cyprus when the Venetians actually ruled the island, and therefore copied by the lace makers in Lefkara. But none of this has actually been scientifically verified.
Okay, and Dollar Merrillees is asking, or commenting first, thank you for a wonderful lecture, Robert, although I'm sure I've never called your pots brown. Do you know if any other places, countries have laid claim to Leonardo in a similar way?
Now, not that I know of, unless somebody in the audience is aware of that. I think this is the only one, and I suppose the real reason is because there were two imperatives in Cyprus when the British were running it that may not have existed anywhere else. And that was because of the need to enhance tourism, which was scarcely developed. And secondly, to demonstrate that Cyprus's indigenous culture included the manufacture of lace, which had absolutely nothing to do with Greek or Turkish origins. And so I can't imagine that the similar circumstances existed elsewhere in the British Empire, or maybe in the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean, for that combination of circumstances to have occurred. And when you look for references to Leonardo's visit to the Levant, there are no other countries that are included in this, except possibly the Lebanon and Egypt. But then only as part of a visit to the Levant, rather than any specific historical association with the countries concerned.
Okay, Despo, you have raised your hand again. Would you like to ask another question?
Yes, we'd like to comment on how to deconstruct a legend like this. I mean, you have done this before, Robert, with Aphrodite.
Yes.
And now, I mean, how do you deconstruct legends like this, which have grown in tourist, as Titina has said, and you know, it was good to hear what people do believe and how do they expect us to behave. We are archaeologists, we depend on evidence, and we have to, of course, keep to that. And when we come to actually portraying this evidence, how do we deconstruct all this that has been created over the years and is in the conscience of people? It is extremely difficult to do so. And people like to believe in a little bit of a fairy tale, let's say. So in trying to create the new Cyprus Museum now and trying to bring the legend of Aphrodite back to what we want to do, we found it quite difficult to bring the legends down, to deconstruct what people have assimilated over so many years. And perhaps the Lefkara lace is a similar story in that, yes, we know that the Lefkarites were doing what they were doing because they were in their suitcases. They were actually carrying antiquities all over the place. The evidence is there in the files. However, when we go to the Lefkara Museum of Embroidery, we cannot really portray this kind of evidence. We have to keep up the story, and what people believe is certainly worthy, and it is something that perhaps is difficult to deconstruct at this period. It is, of course, very nice to know what really happened, and thank you for letting us know that he has never been to Cyprus and also giving us evidence for this. But this is the real problem of how to portray this to the lay people, to the public in general, through the museums and through the tourist. I mean, as a government department, we also have to give our story to the tourist departments and to now the new deputy ministry of tourism. So this is a question for us. But thank you so much for all you have said tonight.
Well, the one comment I would make about that, Despo, is that it's not necessary to deconstruct a legend because it is a legend. It now becomes part of the, as it were, historical and popular record. I suppose the one thing it is most interesting to notice is that whereas in 1981, the Cypriot Post Office produced this series of stamps to commemorate Leonardo da Vinci, there was no such issue in 2019 on the anniversary of his death.
Yes,
and
true.
It's by omission that, in fact, the record, as it were, is not set straight, but just simply allowed to develop independently of the legend. And if you look at the last slide here, Cyprus attractions, Temple of Aphrodite, ruins at Old Paphos, visit Cyprus's first UNESCO World Heritage Archaeological Site. I'm not certain that you need anything more than that for the purposes of publicity.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true.
We have a few comments here. Cynthia Whistle is saying she lived in Cyprus, I'm not sure for how many years, but she didn't ever hear that story until after the 1970s about Leonardo. Yakovnir is saying there should be a connection to talk with Israeli archaeologists. Anyone is, of course, welcome to join in the CAARI lectures, and they are advertised in our mailing list and on Facebook and on Twitter and on Instagram. So, of course, any Israeli archaeologists who would like to join us may join in, Yakov. He's also commenting there are similar Lefkara type works in Bulgaria. I don't know if anyone has explored Bulgarian style traditional lace. Maria Pinguras says, you have to admit that we Cypriots are great storytellers anyway. I think, yes, we would agree with that. Stuart, you have your camera on. Stuart Swinney, would you like to ask a question? Oh, we have no sound. Need to unmute. Oh, sorry, Stuart, we're not catching you. No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
No, typical Robert sort of debunking a factoid is very good, of course, Robert. And no, I don't really have anything to add. It's interesting and it's nice to know what the truth appears to be in connection with Da Vinci's visit. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we have no further questions, so I'm going to Once again, thank Robert so much for this really interesting. Oh, we have one, Pavlos Anastasiadis, with a quick question, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I may have missed part of the lecture. I was following a concomitant presentation of a new book on Famagusta and the history of Famagusta in medieval times. But to challenge Dr. Merrillees, as an academic exercise, is there anything that could be kind of suggestive that there might be a grain of truth in the legend? And in parallel with that, to quote the most eminent of the living Cypriot poets, that myths and legends often capture an essential truth, not accurately, but in some way the essence of something. But the main question is, as an academic exercise, is there anything that might be suggestive that there might be something in the legend?
There is, of course, always elements, and no legend emerges without a certain amount of facts. It's a question of how they're managed. And obviously, there is some link between Leonardo and the Levant, because we know that he himself took a great interest, and the very fact that he knew about Cyprus indicates that he was aware of the existence of this area. The real question is whether or not he traveled to it. And the reason why now there is this legend that he did is simply because there's a gap in the movements that we know from September 1481 and March 1483. And since none of the experts can fill this with any information, there has been a tendency to conflate both his interest in the Levant, of which he was aware, and Cyprus, and also the absence of any knowledge of his movements, and make it, as it were, into the story that he actually did visit the Levant. Now, there is that grain of truth, and no legend actually evolves without some of that. And so it's not really a case of debunking or deconstructing. It's a question of placing it in its own historical context. And there is absolutely no reason why the historical truth shouldn't exist side by side with the myth.
That seems a perfect way to wind this up, Robert. Very wise words. I'm going to press stop recording. I'm not going to end the meeting yet, so we're going to stop, but if people would like to stick around and say hello, you're welcome. But once again, I would very much like to thank Dr. Robert Merrillees for giving us a fascinating lecture this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindy.